Hello, welcome to Biology, the scientific study of life. The cerebellum. The cerebellum develops from parts of the metencephalon. It is important, notice that, it is important for coordination and error checking during motor, perceptual, and cognitive functions. Cognitive functions include learning, decision making, consciousness, and an integrated sensory awareness of the surroundings. The cerebellum is likely involved in learning and remembering motor skills such as those involved in riding a bicycle, because such learning can be blocked by damage to one of its major subdivisions. The cerebellum receives sensory information about the position of the joints and the length of the muscles, as well as information from the auditory and visual systems. It also receives input concerning motor commands issued by the cerebrum. The cerebellum integrates this sensory and motor information as it coordinates movement and balance. Hand-eye coordination is an example of cerebellar control. If the cerebellum is damaged, the eyes can follow a moving object, but they will not stop at the same place as the object. Diencephalon, notice that this is diencephalon. The embryonic diencephalon develops into three adult brain regions: the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. The epithalamus includes the pineal gland and the choroid plexus, one of several clusters of capillaries that produce cerebrospinal fluid from blood. The thalamus and hypothalamus are major integrating centers. The thalamus is the main input center of sensory information going to the cerebrum, and the main output center for motor information leaving the cerebrum. Incoming information from all the senses is sorted in the thalamus and sent to the appropriate cerebral centers for further processing. The thalamus also receives input from the cerebrum and other parts of the brain that regulate emotion and arousal. Although it weighs only a few grams, the hypothalamus is one of the most important brain regions for homeostatic regulation. The hypothalamus is the source of two sets of hormones: posterior pituitary hormones and releasing hormones that act on the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus also contains the body's thermostat, as well as centers for regulating hunger, thirst, and many other basic survival mechanisms. Hypothalamic centers also play a role in sexual and mating behaviors. The fight or flight responses and pleasure stimulation of specific centers can cause what are known as pure behaviors. For example, rats placed in an experimental situation where they can press a lever to stimulate a pleasure center will do so to the exclusion of eating and drinking. Stimulation of another hypothalamic area can produce rage. Circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms in plants, we have already discussed circadian. Animals also exhibit circadian rhythms, one example being the sleep-wake cycle. Numerous studies have shown that animals usually have an internal timekeeper known as a biological clock that is involved in maintaining circadian rhythms. Biological clocks regulate a variety of physiological phenomena, including hormone release, hunger, and heightened sensitivity to external stimuli in mammals. The biological clock is a pair of hypothalamic structures called the subarchiasmatic nuclei SCN. Some clusters of neurons in the SCN or CNS are referred to as nuclei. In contrast, fruit flies Drosophila appear to have many biological clocks in various parts of their body, such as the outer edges of their wings. Biological clocks usually require external cues to remain synchronized with environmental cycles. For example, visual information about light intensity transmitted to the SCN synchronizes the mammalian clock with the nature cycles of day length and darkness. Experiments with rodents have revealed that cells in the SCN produce specific proteins in response to changing light-dark cycles. Human circadian rhythms have been the subject of particularly intense study because upsetting them can cause sleep disorders. In a famous series of experiments in the 1970, researchers housed subjects in comfortable rooms deep underground where the subjects could set their own schedules without external cues. Those experiments suggested that the human biological clock has a cycle length of about 25 hours, with much individual variation. In the late 1990s, however, a research team at Harvard University challenged those findings, pointing out that even indoor lighting can influence circadian rhythms using more rigorous experimental conditions. The Harvard scientists found that the human biological clock has a cycle length of 24 hours and 10 minutes, with very little variation between individuals. The cerebrum develops from the embryonic telencephalon, an outgrowth of the forebrain that arose early in vertebrate evolution as a region supporting olfactory reception as well as auditory and visual processing. The cerebrum is divided into right and left cerebral hemispheres. Each hemisphere consists of an outer covering of gray matter. Notice that this one. Outer covering of gray matter, the cerebral cortex, internal white matter, and groups of neurons collectively called basal nuclei, located deep within the white matter. The basal nuclei are important centers for planning and learning movement sequences. Damage in this region can prevent motor commands from being sent to the muscles, rendering a person passive and immobile. In humans, the largest, most complex part of the brain is the cerebral cortex. Here, sensory information is analyzed, motor commands are issued, and language is generated. The cerebral cortex underwent a dramatic expansion when the ancestors of mammals diverged from those of reptiles. Most significantly, mammals have a region of the cerebral cortex known as the neocortex. The neocortex forms the outermost part of the mammalian cerebrum, consisting of 6 parallel layers of neurons arranged tangential to the brain surface, whereas the neocortex of a rat is relatively smooth. The human neocortex is highly convoluted. The convolutions allow the neocortex to have a large surface area and still fit inside the skull, although less than 5 mm thick. The mammalian neocortex has a surface area of about 0.5 milli to the power 2 to the power, and accounts for about 80% of total brain mass. new human primates and cetaceans, whales and porpoises, for example, also have especially large convoluted neocortices or cortices. In fact, the surface area the surface area relative to body size of a porpoise's neocortex is second only to that of a human. Like the rest of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex is divided into right and left sides, each of which is responsible for the opposite half of the body. The left side of the cortex receives information from and controls the movement of the right side of the body, and vice versa. A thick band of axons known as a corpus callosum enables communication between the right and left cerebral cortices. Damage to one area of the cerebrum early in development can frequently cause redirection of its normal functions to other areas. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this phenomena occurs after an entire cerebral hemisphere is removed in infants as a treatment of severe epilepsy. Amazingly, the remaining hemisphere eventually assumes most of the functions normally provided by both hemispheres. Even in adults, damage to a portion of cerebral cortex can trigger the development to use of new brain circuits, leading to a recovery of function in some cases. The cerebral cortex controls voluntary movement and cognitive functions. Each side of the cerebral cortex is customarily described as having 4 lobes, called the frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal loops. Researchers have identified a number of functional areas within each lobe. These areas include primary sensory area, each of which receives and processes most sensory information, process a specific type of sensory information, and association areas which integrate the information from various parts of the brain. The major increase in the size of the neocortex that occurred during mammalian evolution was mostly an expansion of the association areas that integrate higher cognitive functions and make more complex behavior and learning possible, whereas a neocortex is occupied mainly by primary sensory areas. The human neocortex consists largely of association areas. Information processing in the cerebral cortex. Most sensory information coming into a cortex is directed via the thalamus to primary sensory areas within the lobes, visual information to the occipital lobe, auditory input to the temporal lobe, and somatosensory information about touch, pain, pressure, temperature, and the position of muscles and limbs to the parietal lobe. Information about taste goes to a separate sensory region of a parietal lobe. Olfactory information is sent first to primitive regions of the cortex, that is, regions that are similar in mammals and reptiles, and then via the thalamus to an anterior part of the frontal lobe. The primary sensory areas send information to nearby association areas that can process particular features in the sensory input. In the primary visual cortex, for example, some neurons are sensitive to bars of light that have a certain width and orientation. Information related to such features is combined in association areas dedicated to recognizing complex images such as faces. Based on the integrated sensory information, the cerebral cortex may generate motor commands that cause specific behaviors, moving a limb or saying hello. For example, these commands consist of action potentials produced by neurons in the primary motor cortex, which lies at the rear of the frontal lobe, adjacent to the primary somatosensory cortex. The action potentials travel along axons of the brainstem and spinal cord, where